Hey, welcome back to Understanding Revelation, and this is part 5 in our study. Today we're talking about the unsealing of the scroll. Now, this is really just a continuation of what we talked about in our last time together, which was chapters 4 and 5, the throne room of God. So in the chapter 5, the throne room begins to move to where a scroll is seen in the right hand of God. And a question is asked, kind of a search is put out for who is worthy to unseal the scroll, to open the scroll. And unfortunately, no one is found. No one in the created order of angels or humanity, no one is able to open the scroll. Now, this distresses John, and he begins to weep quite a bit until one of the elders tells him to behold, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the root of David. He's worthy to to open the scroll. And so John turns and he sees what looks like a lamb that had been slain standing in the center of the throne. And that's where we're picking up. Heaven has just erupted in worship. Several different hymns have been sung to the Lamb and to the one who sits on the throne and the Lamb. So we're going to be in Revelation chapter 6 today. If you've got your Bibles, I hope that you'll follow along. So let's jump right in. We will take a look at the first 6 verses, or the first few verses. We'll talk a little bit about that, and then we'll begin to unpack that. But one of the things that I want you to see at the very beginning is that everything that is about to happen is happening because the Lamb is setting it in motion. So whenever you find any of these seals that are being opened, any of the events that are going to happen as we see them progress, everything is because the Lamb is bringing it about. So the theme that we saw repeated over and over in chapters 4 and 5, and will continue throughout the book of Revelation, is the reference to God as the one who is seated on the throne. So we have the sense that is being laid out there at the very beginning, that although things are going to get really crazy, very chaotic, there's just going to be catastrophe that happens upon catastrophe. You know, the temptation that we're going to have is to think that, everything is out of control, that somehow evil is winning. But in reality, what Revelation is showing us that God is in control. And that's why he's referred to over and over as the one who is seated on the throne. So what we're about to see is that the scroll is going to be open. The 7 seals are going to be broken so that the scroll can be opened up. Every single seal is being opened by the Lamb. So what we're seeing, God is in control. He has basically predetermined everything that's going to happen. That's the picture of the scroll being written on both sides, that everything that is going to happen has already been set. It is unchangeable, unalterable, and it is sealed up so that no one can make any kind of changes or somehow circumvent what God is planning. The only one who can set things in motion is the Lamb. And that's what we're going to see going throughout all of this. So this is not somehow evil taken over. This is the Lamb setting everything in motion for the end. So let's get to the passage here. And again, we'll read just a few verses, unpack a little bit here, and then we'll take a look more at what's happening with each of the seals being opened. So starting in verse 1 of chapter 6, it says, "Now I watched when the Lamb opened one of the 7 seals. And I heard one of the 4 living creatures say with a voice like thunder, 'Come.' And I looked, and behold, a white horse. And its rider had a bow, and a crown was given to him, and he came out conquering and to conquer. When he had opened the 2nd seal, I heard the 2nd living creature say, 'Come.' And out came another horse, bright red. Its rider was permitted to take peace from the earth, so that people should slay one another, and he was given a great sword." So let me just stop here. And on these first 2 seals that are open, what we're beginning to see is that a seal is open, and then one of the 4 living creatures steps up to take part in what is happening. So remember from chapter 4, the 4 living creatures are those closest to the throne of God. These are the highest ranking in the divine beings, in the angelic realm. And so they have a place of prominence, a place of power. And what we're going to see is that with the first 4 seals, each of the 4 living creatures are going to take part. So with the first seal, we've got the first living creature, second seal, second living creature, third and fourth, and so on. So what we see is that the Lamb, Jesus, is opening a seal, and that sets forth activity in heaven. And it's starting with these right around the throne itself. So he speaks with a voice like thunder. He is summoning this horse and the rider to come forth. So you got this command of come. And the voice like thunder is reminiscent of what was happening around the throne. That there were lightnings and thunderers that were emanating from the throne of God. So just kind of seems to be that conveyance of the power of God, the authority of God is being exercised through the four living creatures to do this. So in each of these first four seals, we're going to see a horse with a rider on it, and then they are given things. And that's one of the key things to understand. These are not taking anything. They are being given this authority, this power, this task to do. And again, it is coming from the throne room. So God has set all this in place. It's written on the scroll. The Lamb is opening that up. He is executing the commands. And so as that is being done, then the angelic realm becomes involved in carrying that out. So the riders and what you're going to see progressing throughout this are not working on their own accord. They are not working for the dragon or Satan. They are working at the direction of God. So all of this, and again, one of the key things of Revelation, God is in control. God is orchestrating this. God is setting the timing of all of this. So there's a sense of confidence that we as believers can have in the midst of all this that seems like it's crazy. As terrible as things are going to get, we can know that God is in control. Now, let me just side note here, because this is a minor little thing that sometimes becomes a topic of conversation, because you have some translations that refer to this as a scroll. Some have this as a book. The Greek word is biblion. And biblion can mean book or it can mean scroll. So that really doesn't give us any kind of sense of help. And either way, it seems to have like 7 hasps or, the seals, the wax seals that would be going across that. And so some people have gotten caught up in the physical nature, in the mechanics of how that would work. So, if you only take off one seal, how can anything come out? How does that open up the rest of it? And I don't think that's the point. So again, remember, John is using a lot of very symbolic imagery to convey some reality that's being communicated to us. So, John is able to see what looks like a scroll, but the intent of that scroll is to let us know that, number one, God has determined what's going to happen, and number two, it's been completely sealed up so that nobody can alter it or set it in motion unless it's the right one. In this case, it's the Lamb. And so, as he is opening a seal, it's like the power is being released. So, if you have a non-physical thing, you don't have to worry about having to get all 7 seals off before things on the inside can come out. The other thought related to that is, maybe it's just because of the nature of the seal that these things are being able to done. So, whatever is within, like the white rider, is when that seal is broken, that's when that can come out, because that's what's recorded on the seal or whatever. That's speculative. I don't know. And again, it's really irrelevant. The main thing is God has decided what's going to happen. As the seal is open, then we can see the events beginning to unfold. And so that's the main thing. So don't get caught up on, how can you open a book or a scroll, just one seal at a time, and, do other many little scrolls fall out or whatever. So that's not important. So don't get caught up on that. Let's stick to the main thing. All right. So let's move on at the third and the fourth seal. So starting in verse 5, when he opened the third seal, I heard the third living creature say, come. And I looked, and behold, a black horse, and its rider had a pair of scales in his hand. And I heard what seemed to be a voice in the midst of the 4 living creatures saying, a quart of wheat for a denarius, and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius. And do not harm the oil and the wine. And when he'd opened the 4th seal, I heard the voice of the 4th living creature say, come. And I looked, and behold, a pale horse, and its rider's name was Death, and Hades followed him. And they were given authority over 1/4 of the earth to kill with the sword and with famine and with pestilence and by a wild beast of the earth. So the first 4 seals are unlocking what has been called the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. And they are daunting figures indeed. Just a lot of scary images that they convey, especially when you get to that fourth one on the pale horse. So let's take a look and see what it is that they're actually doing, who they are, what they're doing. So in the first four seals, we have the first four horsemen. Now, let me just quickly say, riders 2, 3, and 4 are pretty easy to understand. It's that first rider that's difficult and has created a little bit of confusion or different interpretive conclusions. And so let's take a look at 2, 3, and 4 first, and then we'll come back to that first one. So the second rider is the one on the bright red or fiery red horse. And what we see is that he is the one who is bringing out, he takes peace from the earth, and we have war and violence that ensue from that. So that could be international wars, that could be civil war, and that could also mean the idea of just general violence. Where people are being murdered frequently. So the murder rate, goes up very significantly, even in the absence of war. Where there's just such civil unrest and disorder that it's very prevalent. The third rider, it comes on a black horse, and he's got scales in his hands, and then a voice from among the four living creatures announces that a quart of wheat is going to cost a denarius, and 3 quarts of barley would cost a denarius. But there's a prohibition against harming the oil and the wine. So it seems to be some type of famine or scarcity, at least on a limited scale. So a denarius is a day's wage for an average worker. And a quart of wheat is what one Roman historian recorded as being kind of the daily portion for a man to eat. And so what you're looking at is a day's worth of food for a man is going to cost a day's worth of work. So you have a decrease in food, a scarcity of food, which leads to increased food prices. Now, we're gotten a little taste of this during this COVID thing, especially at the beginning where people were really stocking up here in the US. And so we saw grocery store shelves that were empty. I mean, that is something that most people in living history have never witnessed in the US. We have been a land of plenty, a land of big warehouses and lots of production, and we've had a pretty good supply chain that is able to keep the shelves pretty well stocked. I mean, there might be an occasional slot on the shelf, but we're talking about entire rows and meat cases and produce cases that were empty except for the weird things that most people don't eat. And that's kind of what we're looking at here, although it's relegated to the grains. So for someone who might have a family, then they're going to be looking at the barley. So 3 quarts of barley for a day's wage, so that there's enough to feed everyone at least a meager subsistence. However, the oil and the wine are not affected. And that kind of makes sense. So if we're talking about an intense sort of drought that maybe has not gone very deep within the soil, then the deeper rooted things like olive trees and grapevines would still be able to produce. But the shallow rooted grains, for instance, would probably be deeply affected. And so, grains are really the staple of a lot of people's diets. So that would probably not just be limited to wheat and barley. They're probably symbolically representing all types of grains, including corn and rice. And so that's going to put a damper on a lot of food because a lot of foods are grain based, and that just calorie dense and able to help fill somebody up. So you can imagine how many things would not be available, and if you can find it, it's going to be very expensive. The fourth rider is coming in on the pale or sickly green horse. The Greek word there for that color is chloros. We get the word chlorophyll. The brand of bleach, Clorox, comes from that because chlorine is used in that, and that's a green gas. So the chloros is the Greek word for green. And so it conveys that idea of death green. I mean, that pale, sickly green of death. This is not a pretty horse to look at. And the rider is probably even less attractive. And coming along with death on his horse is Hades, which represents the grave. And so you have these two coming in tandem. Now, we don't know, we're not told if they're riding on the same horse, riding on different horses. Again, It doesn't matter. They're coming together. That's what is being conveyed. And they're given authority over a fourth of the earth to kill with the sword, with violence, so war, murder, whatever, with wild beasts, pestilence, so that could be disease, could be other kind of insect or other kind of infestations, and famine still continues. So there seems to be a logical sequence to this. So war and violence bring about disruption. Disruption in food supply and food production, and that creates famine and scarcity. Famine and scarcity oftentimes lead to other things, and death is certainly among them. So where there's a scarcity of food, people get more violent. And so more people are killed that way. Some people starve. And this seems to be global in its implication there. But that leaves us with that first rider, the rider on the white horse. Now, the reason why this is confusing is because white is usually associated with the holy things in Revelation, the righteous things. So you have God on a white throne. You have Jesus clothed in white. You have the martyrs under the throne being given a white robe. So these are usually associated with good things. And so let's take a look here, because there's also another rider that is mentioned in Revelation 19. And this has led some people to think that somehow or another this relates to Jesus as the first rider. So Revelation 19, then I saw heaven opened, and behold, a white horse. So very similar kind of wording there. The one sitting on it is called Faithful and True, and in righteousness he judges and makes war. His eyes are like a flame of fire, and on his head are many diadems, crowns. And he has a name written that no one knows but himself. And from his mouth comes a sharp sword. That's Revelation 19, 11, and 12, and also verse 15. So it sounds very similar to the first rider. When you look at it, both ride a white horse, both have weapons. So the first rider in Revelation 6 has a bow. The other rider has a sword. Both have crowns. But there's a difference in the Greek. In the Greek in Revelation 6, the first rider there has a Stephanos, which is a victor's crown. It's not a royal crown. However, in Revelation 19, that rider has a royal crown, and the diadem, as it's called in ESV there. So both of them have crowns, but they are different crowns. And both are riding out to conquer. So are they the same? Are they different? I'm going to say they're very different. Very clearly, Jesus has not come at the beginning of Revelation chapter 6. And most commentators would tend to say that this is Jesus in Revelation 19. Clearly, we see that that's him. But in chapter 6, probably most likely, this is the Antichrist. The Antichrist is a counterfeit Jesus. He is a deceiver. When you look at most of the descriptions or related activity to what the Antichrist is doing, deceiving is key among them, that he is setting himself up as a false Jesus, a counterfeit Jesus. And that seems to be what's happening here. So if you kind of are familiar with the idea of the tribulation period and the coming of the Antichrist, now we're going to get into that in a more fuller way later on. But just kind of a brief little snapshot here is that most would tend to think that the Antichrist comes at the beginning of the tribulation period, but he is not fully seen until the middle, when he establishes himself, sets himself up in the temple, demands worship, and basically is ruling the world. So in that first part, he's kind of setting covenants, signing peace treaties, and so forth, and seems to be kind of a good guy. But in the middle, that's where everything changes. And so that seems to be, he's coming along at the very beginning. Most people are not going to recognize him, hey, that's Antichrist, until the midpoint, 3.5 years in. So that's what we're beginning to see right here, is that first rider probably is the Antichrist. So that's the first four seals, the Four Horsemen. So moving on to the fifth seal, the scene changes dramatically. And this is what John records in verse 9. I saw under the altar the souls of those who had been slain. The Greek word is slaughtered, for the word of God and for the witness they had borne. They cried out with a loud voice, O sovereign Lord, holy and true, How long before you will judge and avenge our blood on those who dwell on the earth? Then they were each given a white robe and told to rest a little longer until the number of their fellow servants and their brothers should be complete, who were to be killed as they themselves had been. Hmm. So there's a lot in this. First thing is that we're seeing is that during this time that the Antichrist is rising, so from the very beginning, Christians have been persecuted, they've undergone tribulation, and they've undergone martyrdom. Even our day, we see this happening. We saw ISIS do this, beheading many Christians in the Middle East. We see China doing this. We've seen other countries, Boko Haram, doing this on a wide scale in Africa. It's tragic to see. And there have probably been more Christians martyred in the last 100 years than in the 2,000 years up until that point, which is staggering to consider when you know early church history. So if those estimates are right, that's an amazing thing. But what we see is that that is going to continue in the tribulation period, that Christians will be martyred. They will be killed because of their faith, their loyalty to Jesus. And so what we see is that the Christians who are killed are pictured as being under the altar of God. Now, this is the first time that temple language is being applied to the throne room of God. Now, we're going to see that as we get further into Revelation, but here we have the first kind of reference to that, and that's the altar of God. Now, Hebrews makes mention that the physical temple on earth, Solomon's temple, was actually modeled as a shadow of the temple in heaven. So that's the real temple is there. That's where God dwells. Everything else, even with the Shekinah glory, is just kind of a shadow of those things that are the reality in heaven. And so Christians then are pictured almost like a sacrifice. In Leviticus, when the animals would be sacrificed, some of it would be sprinkled on the horns of the altar, and then more of the blood would be poured at the base of the altar. And that's where we see these believers, that they have been sacrificed for the kingdom. And we are encouraged in Romans chapter 12 to live our lives as living sacrifices, to take up our crosses daily, and just a willingness to be able to lay down our lives if that's what the Lord requires for the advancement of his kingdom and the advancement of the gospel. And that's what these have done. And so they're pictured as sacrifices, but they're also pictured as being safe. So, it's real easy for us to think that people who get, killed for the faith are, those poor people. Oh my goodness, they live in such terrible situation and they had to die. But that's so upside down from the way that Jesus presents that. We tend to think of them as forsaken. Jesus calls them blessed. Blessed are you when you are persecuted for my name's sake. Blessed are you when you're killed. And so it gives a place of privilege that these are in that close proximity to God, close enough that they're able to cry out to him and close enough to get an answer. And that's an amazing thing that we need to get in our heart, that martyrdom is not being forsaken by God. It is a privilege to be able to give our lives that way. And so they are where they were beaten and abused by the world, and they were in the most unsafe circumstances. Now they are in the safest place in the presence of God. And where they were the hated and despised of the world, now they are the privileged and esteemed in heaven. So they are there under the altar. But I want you to see, they're awake and aware. So there is an idea that when a person dies, their soul just goes to sleep. You're unconscious. You don't know anything until the resurrection. And that's when your soul and your body are resurrected. Revelation 6 paints a very different picture. When the fifth seal is open, we see these Christians are not asleep at all. They're very much awake. They're very vibrant, and they are very animated, calling out to God. So they're aware of what's happened to them, and they're aware of what's happening in the world, and they're aware all the more now of just how good and right God is, how perfect heaven is, and how far off earth is. And they're crying out, "Oh, sovereign Lord, how long until you judge this and set this right?" So this is a call for vindication, a call for setting things right. It's not a call for revenge. They're not individually singling out those that might have had a part in taking their lives. They just see how far off the world is that God has created, and they're wanting to see that come back to what God really intended. So after they make this plea, they're told, they're given a white robe, and then they're told to hang on, to rest just a little while longer until the number of their fellow servants and brothers should be complete. And who are those? Those are the ones who must also be killed. Now, this does not mean that God has a little tally sheet and he has a number that, he's trying to get up to before, we can bring this all about. That's not the point here. The point is there have always been Christians that have been killed. There will be Christians who are killed during the tribulation, and there will be even more who are going to be killed during that great tribulation period. And so that's the reality that this is preparing us for, but it is a place of privilege that they have. So the fifth seal is a peek under the altar, if you will, but what is happening within the fifth seal has been going on from the beginning and will continue to the end. Now the sixth seal jumps ahead a little bit in time, more toward the end of everything. And this is when we begin to see the natural disasters and the cosmic calamity. This is the scary stuff. Because if you are living when this is going on, it's pretty intense. Nothing like this has ever happened on planet Earth, and it's going to be global in its scope. So this is what it says here. It's starting in verse 12. There was a great earthquake, and the sun became black as sackcloth, and full moon became like blood, and the stars of the sky fell to the earth, as a fig tree sheds its winter fruit when shaken by a gale. The sky vanishes like a scroll that is being rolled up, and every mountain and island was removed from its place. Then the kings of the earth, and the great ones, and the generals, and the rich and the powerful, and everyone, slave and free, hid themselves in the caves and among the rocks of the mountains, calling to the mountains and rocks, fall on us and hide us from the face of him who is seated on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb, for the great day of their wrath has come, and who can stand? So here's some of the things that we're seeing in this. Number one, there's a huge earthquake that happens. And then the sun is darkened, full moon like blood, and stars fall to earth. So there's some kind of cataclysmic event that takes place. The earthquake seems to be the 10.0 global earthquake. There's not a place anywhere that's not unshaken by this. So it says that every mountain, verse 14, an island was removed from its place. So it is global in the perspective, and it's so huge that the mountains themselves seem to be shaken off their foundation. So everything is affected by this. The sun is darkened and the full moon like blood. Now, this is interesting. And again, we're not told exactly what this means or how it happens, because it could happen because the huge earthquake creates a dust cloud from what's happening. The huge earthquake activates some volcanic activity, which adds more smoke to the sky. The earthquake sets off fires, which adds more smoke to the sky. And so, the sun and the moon are blotted out. That's one possibility. Another possibility is some type of eclipsing event. So when you're hearing full moon like blood, that's typically a reference to a solar eclipse. However, the sun is also darkened. A solar eclipse and a lunar eclipse cannot happen simultaneously in nature. They happen in two different phases of the moon. A blood moon happens during a full moon, and that's what it says here, full moon like blood. And a solar eclipse happens during a new moon. So two opposite phases of the moon. So, is this a cloud that's obscuring the view? Is it maybe the moon is full, but there's some other celestial object that comes between Earth and the sun? We're not sure, because it seems like this now is affecting not just Earth, but the solar system that we're in, because you have the stars falling to the Earth. So, is this comet fragments? Is this meteorites, a huge meteor storm that hits? Or is this, something else? We don't know. All that we know is this cosmic calamity, and it's bad. And it's so bad that everybody is running away. Oh, by the way, here's this weird mention in here: the sky is rolled up like a scroll. So it's almost that picture of whatever happens is such that the constellations as we know them are not visible anymore, or they've been altered. And if that's the case, then we're talking about a universe-wide kind of event. Um, every mountain and island is removed from its place. We mentioned that with the huge earthquake. And it says that everyone is trying to hide and take refuge. Now, notice that in verse 15, there's 7 classes of people that are mentioned, which is, again, 7 meaning completion. It's trying to indicate that everybody, from the rich to the poor, from the powerful to the not, to the slave, everyone is running and hiding. I mean, when you've got an earthquake that big, obviously houses are in ruins and people are looking for some kind of shelter, some kind of place to take refuge. And it's interesting because in these 7 classes, kings of the earth, great ones, generals, rich and powerful, 5 of them are talking about the rich and powerful. And I think there's an emphasis on that in particular, just to say it doesn't matter who you are, no matter how much money or power you have, you cannot escape the wrath of God when it comes. There is only one escape, and that is through Jesus and Jesus alone. But here very clearly, we see that they are trying to hide, and they're doing this in a recognition. And this is how Revelation is announcing what stage we're in. For the great day of wrath has come. So this is very clearly, we're now in the stage of God's wrath here. And this is, so the 6th seal seems to be the beginning of God's wrath. The 7th seal is going to be the consummation, the ending of it. And in between there, you've got the trumpets and the bowls. Now, we're going to do another video on that, show how they're related, and maybe help to unlock the chronology of Revelation a little bit better. So let's look at the 7th seal. So the 7th seal, when the Lamb opened the 7th seal, there was silence in heaven for about half an hour. Something big is happening. And it has even silenced heaven. Then I saw 7 angels who stand before God, and 7 trumpets were given to them. And another angel came and stood on the altar with a golden censer. And he was given much incense to offer with the prayers of all the saints on the golden altar before the throne. And the smoke of the incense with the prayers of the saints rose before God from the hand of the angel. Then the angel, get this, took the censer and filled it with fire from the altar and threw it on the earth. And there were peals of thunder, rumblings, flashes of lightning, and an earthquake. So the silence for about half an hour. About 3 different mentions of silence in heaven, and they all seem to be related to the day of the Lord. Zephaniah 1:7 is a great example. Be silent before the Lord God, for the day of the Lord is near. Now is the day of the Lord. That's what this is announcing. This is the day of judgment, the day of the Lord that has come. And here is that silence. This is a new thing that is about to be done. God is about to put an end to his precious created order, and he is about to reset all of creation. And it is such a momentous event that it has created that moment of silence in heaven for about half an hour. And then we have the distribution of trumpets. So 7 trumpets are given to 7 angels that are in the presence of God. And again, we'll talk more about those and what happens when the trumpets are blown, but they're related here to this 7th seal. And again, that goes back to everything is emanating from what the Lamb is initiating. And here's the amazing thing in this passage is that our prayers are weaponized. Isn't that an amazing thought? I mean, because sometimes it feels like our prayers are pointless, that they're powerless, that they bounce off the ceiling, nobody's hearing, they're not going to have any effect. And yet, here at the end, when God's wrath is being consummated, it is the prayers that are being taken, put in a censer, and the angel hurls that at earth. And then you have these further cataclysmic things that are going to wrap everything up. Yeah, I don't know about you, but it's frustrating sometimes to feel like, I'm praying and nothing's happening. And certainly those prayers when I see evil in the world and I want things to change and I don't know if they're ever being heard. And yet here is that picture and that encouragement that we have that our prayers are being heard and they're being stored in the presence of God, waiting for the right moment to be activated. And that is an amazing thought that when you consider that this angel is taking those, and even before that, we saw in chapter 4 and 5 that the 24 elders around the throne were holding bowls that are the prayers of his people, constantly keeping our prayers in front of him. Folks, this should drive us all the more to pray and give us confidence in praying, because there's coming a day when all those "how long, O Lord" prayers that we prayed and that the saints under the altar have been praying. How long do we have to endure this? How long does this have to go on? How long until you come and set everything right? When that moment comes, that "how long, O Lord" is now. And then the way that Jesus taught us to pray, "Our Father who is in heaven, hallowed be your name." Hallow your name. At that moment, God's name is going to be hallowed in all of creation. And when we pray, "God, let your kingdom come," his kingdom comes here and now in this. And when we pray, "Let your will be done," it is done perfectly on earth as it is in heaven, and nothing can stand against it. And when we have prayed and prayed, "God, deliver us from the evil one," here that deliverance finally comes. And he has weaponized our prayers, and they have a powerful impact on planet Earth in setting everything right. Man, there's a lot in that. So the 7 seals have been opened. We'll talk about that interlude in between of chapter 7. If you were paying close attention, you saw that chapter 6 was the first 6 seals. Then chapter 7 takes a break from that, and then chapter 8 is where we pick back up with the 7th seal. We'll talk about that in a future episode. But I want you to take a look, because sometimes we ask, how does this fit into the big picture? Well, there is a close paralleling to Matthew 24 and the 7 seals of Revelation. And when we look at that, it's just, wow, okay, now we see. And Revelation is not going to tell us anything different. I mean, it's not going to tell us anything contradictory to what God has already revealed in other places. And so the longest place where we've been told most clearly and plainly what is going to happen is Matthew 24. And it's Jesus who is telling us. And so we know with a lot of confidence, this is how things are going to play out. And it's amazing to see how things fall in line with Matthew 24. So take a look at that with me here. And this is still kind of a work in progress, because I had just been praying through this. And oftentimes when I've read through this, I think, man, there seems to be a parallel here. And finally, after doing more deep study, I see a number of different commentaries that are affirming what I've just kind of been sensing in Scripture. And so let's take a look. And here's the first 2 seals. And some of it isn't just, I mean, point for point clear. But when we get down later on, you're going to see just how that lines up so closely. So the first seal, again, is the rider on the white horse. And we understand that is the Antichrist. He is the deceiver. In Matthew 24, again, now this is the moment when the disciples, they're leaving the Temple Mount area and they're admiring the temple. They see the great big stones on there and they're marveling at that. And Jesus injects into that conversation, look, I tell you, not one stone is going to be left on another. Well, that weighs on the disciples, and they go across the Kidron Valley over to the Mount of Olives. And when they get over there, they ask him, Lord, when is that going to take place? And what are going to be the signs of your coming? And so here's how he begins that answer. Point 1, see that no one leads you astray. For many will come in my name saying, I am the Christ, and they will lead many astray. So the deceiving Antichrist kind of persona that is there, and John tells us in 1 John that there are indeed many Antichrists. They're in the world now. Later on is going to be the Antichrist with a big A. This seems to be that connection there. The second seal is the fiery red, bright red horse that takes peace away from the earth, and we see violence and wars and death, murders. And so Matthew 24, and you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you're not alarmed, for this must take place, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom will rise against kingdom. Now, when he's saying that the end is not yet, he's saying that this is not the moment that I'm coming back. He's not dismissing that this is not what is leading up to his return. And there seems to be that idea that there are going to be more wars. I mean, there's always been war. And the wars have been, especially in the last century and change, getting more intense. And more people have been killed in some of the more recent wars than ever before, and greater atrocities that have been taking place. That seems to be going to be ramping up all the more as we get toward the end when Jesus comes. Third seal is the black horse and the famine and the scarcity of food. Matthew 24, and there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are but the beginning of the birth pains. Seal 4. And I look, behold, the pale horse. So this is death and Hades coming along. Matthew 24. Again, this is just following sequentially, verse for verse there. Then they will deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. And then many will fall away and betray one another and hate one another. And many false prophets will arise and lead many astray. And because lawlessness will be increased, the love of many will grow cold. So the death aspect in there in particular is aimed at, in this sense, Christians in particular. But we see that lawlessness is increasing throughout the world. Violence is increasing. Death is increasing as we do. Just a side note here, again, we've touched on this before. There's that school of thought that says Christians will not go through the tribulation because God's not going to tribulate them. That's not what Scripture teaches about tribulation. Jesus says it's not God doing the tribulating, the troubling, the distressing. It's the world that is tribulating the Christians. Do you see the difference? The source is not God. The source is the world. And the object of the tribulation is the people of God. Now, there is great distress going on in the world as environmental things are being affected. But as Jesus talks about tribulation, he is focusing in on the fact that it's the world that is distressing, troubling, persecuting, pressuring Christians. And they're going to kill, and they're going to be hated by everyone. And when it says all nations, that includes our nation. Whatever nation you're in, just fill that in. So just a little side note there. But related to that, many are going to fall away. That's many Christians fall away, betray one another, hate one another. So they're turning them over to the authorities, and they're going to be killed. So death is on the increase in the world. Seal 5 is that glimpse at the altars, or the souls under the altar of God. And again, I think I mentioned this, that we're given a peek when the seal is open, but this is something that has been going on throughout time, will be going on through the tribulation, and certainly increasing as we get into that greater part of the tribulation. So here's just some of the things from Matthew 24 and also from Revelation 13 is related to the souls under the altar. Remember, they were killed in Revelation 6 for their witness. They're calling out, how long until you avenge the world? They're given a robe, told to wait until the full number is complete of other Christians that are going to be killed. So 24:14, and this gospel will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all the nations, and then the end will come. So the souls under the altar in Revelation 6, they're killed for their witness, for their testimony, that they have borne. And this is where 15, where it changes from you're going to be witnessing to now verse 15. So when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, and then verse 21, because we got a whole lot of information in this paragraph, a little too much to include here, but here's one of the key thoughts that comes out of that. The abomination of desolation is the beast of Revelation 13. He's the Antichrist. So when you see the Antichrist, then there's going to be great tribulation. And it's going to be great tribulation such as never been from the beginning until now. Nope, and never will be again. So this is the moment that the Antichrist is revealed. There's great tribulation. It is directed a lot toward believers. And so we get more of that picture of what's happening here under the altar, why there's souls there. Revelation 13:7, this is the chapter that talks about the beast that comes on the scene. And in verse 7, also, the beast was allowed to make war on the saints and to conquer them. So he's given authority to kill Christians. And right after that is where it says, look, if you're destined to go, to be taken away, you're going to be taken away. And if you're destined to be killed with the sword, you're going to die by the sword. And that's the reality. And I think this, again, speaks so much to the purpose of the book of Revelation. It is to prepare the church for endurance and for engagement, that we are going to suffer a lot during that time. Christians should expect trouble. We should expect hardship coming from the world because we follow Jesus. And we need to endure through the pain, endure through the scarcity, endure through the deprivation that will come. So that's part of what's being laid out there. And even enduring through the point of death. That should be an expected reality for those that we stand diametrically opposed to the world and the world system and where it's going. We're told in 1 John not to love the world. And so we need to divorce ourselves from the world and prepare, ourselves to be kingdom-minded, kingdom citizens, and to endure and engage. Because you see the gospel going all the way to the end. Christians are not being silent during this time. It's actually during this in Luke, that we're told that we're going to be taken before kings and not to worry about what we're going to say when we get there, that we are going to be given a powerful witness at that moment. So we get to see the hand of God during that time like we typically don't today. It's a privilege to be in that point. So seal number 6, you got the great earthquake, sun becomes black as sackcloth, full moonlight becomes like blood, stars of the sky fell to the earth, and the people are crying out to the rocks, fall on us. So hear this, immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. So we have identical things that are happening here. So again, all that we've done with the seals in Matthew 24 is just go sequentially down one after the other, and very clearly here at the 6th seal, it lines up. But what I want you to see is at this point, when the people are mourning, when they're crying out, the wrath of the Lamb and God has come. So we're at that place where Jesus has first come. This is his return. There has not been any mention of any kind of secret return. There's not been any mention of Christians being taken away in either one of these passages. And it's difficult to come away with that conclusion unless we impose it on the text. But if you just read it for what it says, this is the first time that Jesus comes on the scene. And when he comes, it is now time to judge, and the 7th seal is time for the reaping. It says, then I saw the 7 angels who stand before God, and the 7 trumpets were given to them. And another angel came and stood at the altar with a golden censer, and he was given much incense to offer with the prayers of the saints on the golden altar before the throne. So we've got now the prayers being cast down to earth, and then there's rumblings and thunder and flashes of lightning and an earthquake. And chapter 24, verse 31, the verse immediately after what we just saw, is that he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the 4 winds, from one end of heaven to the other. Now we know, because 1 Corinthians 15 tells us explicitly, clearly, that Jesus comes at the last trumpet. There's not going to be any more. So these seven trumpets will be sounded. And it's a little difficult to kind of get the verses together because, again, I think 6 and 7, the seals 6 and 7 are so closely tied together that it's hard to really distinguish between the two of them, so that you got the verses in chapter 24, 39, or 29 through 31 that are really close in there. But there is a span of time that is being implied within this because of the seven trumpets are going to be sounded. Now, again, we're going to talk more about the seven trumpets and seven bowls probably in the next episode. So stay tuned, because that helps us to unlock more of the chronology, the order of the events of the book of Revelation. So there is just a lot of close proximity, a parallel, mirroring of Matthew 24 and Revelation 6, and then the first part of Revelation chapter 8 when you've got the seven seals. So again, this is a work in progress for me. I don't claim that this is, the be all and end all definitive way that this plays out. But, over the years, this is how it has just kind of been coming together for me. And by the way, if you see some holes in this some way, mention that in the comments below. Not looking for debates or anything, but just, if you see something, I'd like to know, because I'm a student, I'm a fellow student. I'm wanting to learn, wanting to grow, and would appreciate, insight if I'm missing the mark somewhere on that. But I think it's worth considering the similarities between the two, and that kind of helps us to give us a sense of maybe timing and so forth of things. Now, I'm going to show you just how, in my mind, this looks, and some caveats here. I'm a pathetic artist. And so stick figures are my best things, and this is even worse than a stick figure that I'll show you. And it's approximations. It's not intended to be, precise detail of timing and so forth. And number three, it's a work in progress. So this could look differently, years down the road, or maybe even next month, as I dig deeper and continue to learn more. So this is kind of the best approximation that I can come up with to show just how the seals are playing out. So the big line horizontally across the middle of the page, that would represent that 7-year period of tribulation. And I think most commentators, no matter what camp they're coming from, particularly if they're in a premillennial camp, would say that this is that 7 years leading up to the time that Jesus returns. So that would be after the 6th and 7th seals on the right-hand side there. In the middle of that 7 years, in the 3.5-year mark, is where we see fully the Antichrist, the abomination of desolation, or the beast. So the first 4 seals seem to precede that. And the 4 horsemen are beginning to set the stage, in part by creating more global chaos. In chapter 13, we see the beast rising out of the sea. The sea in Revelation and other parts of the Bible represent chaos. So it's a chaotic world, and people are desperate for someone to come and bring some order. And that's, I think, why the Antichrist becomes an attractive figure, because he does bring, like Hitler and post-World War I Germany, it had the promise of restoration of power and peace to the German people and stability. And they voted in them freely. So the first 4 seals predate that point. We have the Antichrist coming on the scene very beginning, and he's building up to that point where he's going to be elevated and exalted and so forth. And the other 3 are doing their deeds. So, how long that takes, we don't know. How long is the timing between the 4 horsemen? We don't know. We're not given any kind of chronology on time markers or anything on that. They could be coming almost simultaneously, for that matter, but they seem to be sequentially. The 5th seal you see below, because again, Christians have been martyred all throughout time. And the 5th seal is simply a peek under the throne, or under the altar, so that we can see them there and catch that glimpse, or hear a little bit of that conversation, to realize that not only have they been martyred during the tribulation, but they're going to be more that are going to be martyred. And so that extends throughout that whole period of tribulation, the whole 7 years, probably at an increasing scale as you move toward the end. And then the 6th and 7th seals seem to be after a span of time after the 4th horseman. 4th horseman is probably still active, and maybe not, I don't know. But the 6th and 7th seals seem to be during that period of wrath right at the very end. So don't look at that and think it's drawn to scale. It's not. I'm just simply trying to convey the 6 and 7 tend to happen toward the end. The Antichrist is going to come on the scene. He's going to do his horrendous Antichristy things. Christians are going to be killed. He's setting up his one world government, his cashless society, so that nobody can buy or sell without the mark and all those kind of things. And again, we'll talk more about the Antichrist later. But these two seals seem to be compressed together and interconnected. And we're going to look more in the next episode of how the 6 and 7 seals relate to the 7 trumpets and the 7 bowls, because that helps just clear up a lot when you see that. So stay tuned for that. That'll be coming up soon. So I'm sure you got some questions, and if you do, hope that you'll leave those in the comments below. And certainly if you saw something that maybe you see from a different perspective and want to share that, feel free to do that. Again, we're not looking to start any kind of debates, and we're not looking to be ugly. We want to be Christian in our discussions that we have here. And certainly if you see something, say, Randy, I think, you're missing something here. Did you consider this? I would appreciate that, honestly. But if you did find this to be helpful, I do hope that you'll like it and share it with someone else. And, if you want to continue to follow this and anything else that I do in my teachings and preaching, feel free to subscribe. Would love to have you on the channel, and certainly appreciate you doing that, because that certainly helps to get that out to others as well. So thanks a lot for joining us today. Look forward to seeing you again real soon. And until then, may the Lord richly bless you, and Maranatha, come Lord Jesus. Amen and amen.